Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 37 through 50 in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. We begin with the story of Joseph, and it's not going to start with a good story because there's already a conflict. Remember that Jacob has sons and a daughter by a number of different wives, by Leah, by Rachel, by their handmaidens, and Rachel has always been his favorite. And so Joseph, the firstborn son of Rachel, is going to be his favorite son. But that means he's got a lot of older brothers, and that's not normally the way it would take place in the ancient world. Normally, the firstborn was the favorite and the one that got all of the inheritance. Well, as we begin to see the story, as it begins to unveil in chapter 37, Joseph gives a bad report against his brothers to their father. And it's not that Joseph is being mean, it's just that they've done some things wrong, and Joseph is telling the truth. Now, you might think, well, he's a little bit of a tattletale, and maybe I wasn't there, so I can't speak about that. But then Jacob fans the flames of hostility by giving Joseph a tunic. Now, when we read about this tunic, it's described adversely as either a tunic with sleeves, or the same term can be used to describe a tunic of, like a coat of many colors, a tunic with many colors. Which is it? Not sure. We have examples of both in the ancient world and in this particular Hebrew phrase. But whatever it is, it's seen by the brothers to be a sign of leadership, where Joseph is being raised to a position of leadership. Remember, he's just a kid. The older brothers are quite a bit older. They're adults, and yet he's been raised to this period, this arena of leadership. Next, Joseph begins to have some dreams, and these dreams he takes it as having import and being from God. Turns out that they were. um, Let me just say for the record, I've had dreams, and I've had some weird dreams, and none of mine seem to be from God. As far as I can tell, they're just, maybe the results of eating too much spicy food the night before or something like that. But he has dreams. In one of the dreams, they each have sheaves assigned to the brothers. Now, a sheaf of grain would be where you've cut the grain and then you've bound it together so it's more manageable, so you can move it. And the other brothers, their sheaves bowed down to Joseph's sheaf. And then a second dream in which the sun, the moon, and 11 stars, and they can count, they know how many brothers there are, all bow down to Joseph. And when we see the same imagery in Revelation chapter 12, where there's a woman clothed in the sun, the moon, and 12 stars, you're supposed to say, I remember that. That's from Joseph's dream. That's a picture of Israel. And Jacob hears about that dream, and Jacob says, what's this? I and your mother, or I and my wives are also going to bow down before you. What's that about? But Joseph had the dream, and it turns out it's actually going to be prophetic. Next, the brothers are sent. Remember, they're shepherds, and when you're shepherds, you have to go out to places where to keep your sheep, to feed your sheep, where there are no farms, or else the sheep they'll just eat the crops, and can't have that. That people would be out barbecuing sheep as a result of that, and so they have to take the sheep from one location to another, and Jacob, the father, sends Joseph to check up on his brothers. And you give one bad report. How are they going to be doing now? And he actually has to trace them down. They've moved from location to location, and they finally see him coming. And they look. They say, "Look, we recognize the coat. Here comes Joseph, the one that gave us a bad report, the one that Dad's been setting up to be the leader. Let's kill him." And so they plot a murder. But Reuben's the firstborn. He's the oldest. And Reuben has gotten into trouble with Dad over some issues where he had taken his father's concubine and had slept with her. That's just like, even for back then, that was a no-no. And his father's gotten upset with him, and so Reuben comes up with an alternate plan. He says, well, let's just take him and throw him down into a pit. And Reuben is thinking, and then after the fact, I can come and rescue him, and I'll be the hero, and I'll be okay with Dad again. And so that's Reuben's idea. And so they take Joseph, they don't kill him, they throw him into a pit. And while they're thinking, and Reuben is away, plotting the rescue, One of the other brothers, he's not the oldest, he's not even the second or third oldest, he's down there a bit, but he is the leader. Some people can be a leader whether they have a title or not, and that's Judah. We're going to see him doing a lot of leading in this story. And Judah comes up with a plan. Actually, as happenstance, he sees a caravan passing by, and he says, "Let's not leave him in the pit. Let's not murder him. Let's sell him into slavery. That way, we'll be rid of him. We'll make a little bit of a profit over it." And everybody likes the idea. Reuben's not there, and they take him out of the pit. They sell him as a slave to these passing merchants who are on their way to Egypt, and Joseph is going to be taken down to Egypt now. However, before we get to Joseph in Egypt, there's a interlude, a second story, and it's about Judah, the one who had convinced his brothers, and we're going to see him doing some. Well, it's not really going to be leadership material, but it will lead to that eventually. And in this story, Judah takes a Canaanite wife. That wasn't really a good thing because Canaanite wife is going to become with Canaanite religion, and you've heard the expression, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, and so he's going to end up with Canaanite children, or so it looks. Now, it's not going to go that bad, but still, it's not going to be a good story. He takes a Canaanite wife, and then he chooses a Canaanite wife for his son. You see, the influence is already there. And so his son marries this Canaanite woman by the name of Tamar, and then that son dies. And there was a practice actually throughout most of the Middle Eastern ancient world known as the Levirate marriage. And this Levirate custom would be that if a man died after having gotten married, but they had no children yet, maybe the marriage hadn't been consummated or whatever, the wife hasn't had any children, then it was the duty of the next son in line. Remember, the firstborn son, he's the heir, and so the nextborn son is supposed to take that wife and have children by her, so that those children can now be the heir, and it will really be sort of replacing the son that died. That's the idea behind it. And so Tamar, the wife, goes to the next son, and he dies. And now Tamar, there is a younger son, but he's sort of young. And I think Judah's thinking, what's going on with Tamar? Is she like a little black widow, or maybe unlucky or cursed or something? And so she's sent back home to daddy. And Judah says, I'll give you a call when the next son gets old enough. And then he's going to lose her phone number. He's going to forget about her. And time goes on, and she realizes she's been sort of put to the side and forgotten. And so she comes up with a plan to make this Levirate custom come back into action. And what she does, she pretends to be a prostitute. She dresses up like a prostitute, and she sets herself up on the path, like in I guess what would have been their version of a red light district. And she waits for Judah to come along. I don't think she's taking any other customers. She's really looking out for Judah, or I suppose that younger brother, but he's not around. And she waits for Judah to come along, and she enlists him as a customer. And so he goes into her. Now, she says, "What are you going to, how are we going to do this payment wise?" And Judah says something to the effect, "Well, I left my credit card at home." But that's okay. He's going to leave his staff and his seal. These are like his ID cards, his identification. And those are left for her with a promise, I'll bring you back some sort of payment. Now, they didn't have coins, so it wasn't going to be in money. It was going to be in barter. And they lay together, and he goes on his way. Meanwhile, Tamar has become pregnant, but she's left the location, and Judah actually tried to send the payment, and there was nobody there. So after this, what happens is she becomes pregnant. She's going to have not just a son, but she's going to have two sons. It's going to be twins. But Judah hears Tamar has become pregnant. Oh, he figures out a way to sort of cast her completely to the side. She apparently has been sort of messing around with other men, and so therefore we can get rid of her. She's played the part of a prostitute, which she has, but and so she says, "Okay, that's true. You're right. However, here's the credit card. The staff and the seal of my quote unquote customer. It happens to be you, Judah." And he looks at that and he says, "Well, I can't very well pass judgment when I was the guilty one." So he doesn't sleep with her anymore, but she now becomes part of the family, and her sons will become part of the family, both Perez and Zerah, which is sort of interesting because Zerah is the word for seed. Just go figure on that one. Now, as we come back to chapter 39, the camera returns to Joseph. He's now arrived in Egypt, and he is sold as a slave to an Egyptian by the name of Potiphar. Joseph is taken, he's made a slave, and as time goes on, Joseph is found capable, and eventually he rises to the top. He's still a slave, but he is put in charge of Potiphar's household as sort of his chief steward. And things are going well until Potiphar's wife takes notice of him, and she is trying to seduce him, and he won't have any part of that. He says, "Well, look, your master. You want me to fool around against him, and he's treated me very well." And so she goes from trying to seduce him to accusing him of attempted rape, um, and it's sort of ironic where when Joseph had been cast into the pit and sold into slavery, they had taken that hated coat of many colors and they had taken a goat and killed it and sprinkled goat's blood all over it. And they didn't have DNA checks back then, so they had taken it back to their father Jacob and said, "Hey, look what we found! We found this coat of many colors." And he recognized it and he said, "Oh, Joseph must have been killed, and that coat, that piece of clothing, was used to deceive." Well, she does the same thing, not by using anything with blood on it, but she grabs a hold of part of his garment, and he slips out of it and runs away. And she says, "See, here's his garment," using his clothes to make a false charge against him. It's an ironic how clothes enter into the story repeatedly, which reminds me of how Jacob had put on certain like clothing to make him appear as though he were Esau. Remember, had dressed up in sort of an Esau suit. So there's clothes all throughout the story here. And so Joseph now is taken and thrown into prison. Now remember, he's still a slave, but now he's a slave in prison. The fact that he's thrown into prison instead of having certain body parts cut off make me wonder whether Potiphar actually believed his wife's claim. Maybe he knew, maybe he had an idea of his wife, and he has to do something just for honor's sake, but he doesn't kill Joseph. He hasn't thrown into prison, and I can't help but note that. And while Joseph is in prison now, two VIPs are also thrown into prison, the cupbearer of the Pharaoh and also the baker of the Pharaoh. And Joseph is made the slave of those two prisoners. So he's gone from being a slave to being a slave in prison, and then to being a slave of other prisoners in prison. This is like going downhill. And then the cupbearer and the baker each have dreams. And Joseph he says, "Well, let me hear your dreams." And they tell the dreams. And the cupbearer has a dream which foretells the idea that he's going to be set free. And Joseph says to him, "Well, when you're set free, can you remember me? Maybe put in a good word for me somewhere." And the baker, his dream indicates that he's going to be set free permanently. He's going to be killed. And it's both are going to take place within 3 days. And sure enough, 3 days later, the baker is put to death, and the cupbearer is set free and returns back to his former bearing of the cup of the Pharaoh. It's sort of again a VIP position. And he forgets all about Joseph. And so Joseph continues to be in prison, and a month passes, and another month, and a year, and another year, and he's still left there in prison. And now something new happens. The Pharaoh has a dream. And the Pharaoh's dreams, he actually has two of them. In one of them, he sees fat cows there by the Nile River, and then skinny cows come up and there's 7 fat cows, and then 7 skinny cows come up out of the river and eat the 7 fat cows. Now that just had to look weird. That was like a strange dream. And then he has a second dream, even perhaps even more strange, where there's 7 fat ears of corn. I'm not sure what a fat ear of corn looks like. It just looks really good. And then 7 skinny ears of corn grow up and eat the. I'm not even sure how they do that, but they eat the 7 ears of fat corn. And Joseph hears the dream. Now it's interesting, the idea of Egyptian dreams. We know this from secular history, that the Egyptians actually had a whole book of dreams. And you would look it up, you would look up what the dream was, and it would supposedly tell you the meaning of the dream. But these dreams were so strange, they never made it into the book. So this is just like two really weird dreams. And Joseph says it represents Egypt. Right now, we're in the middle of 7 really good years, and they're not beginning now. We're already into those years. And everything is growing, and Egypt is prospering. But when those 7 years are done, we're going to have 7 bad years, 7 years of famine. So we've got good years right now, and there's 7 years of famine. And the thing that you ought to do is prepare now for the bad times that are coming. Take the food and store it away, and just be aware it's going to have to last 7 years. So ration it out, so that nobody starves to death. People might have a difficult time with it. They might go a bit hungry, but there won't be mass starvation. So that's the plan. And the Pharaoh really likes the plan, and so the Pharaoh takes Joseph and makes him in charge of the plan. He makes him, I guess we would say, viceroy of Egypt. And sure enough, the prophecy begins to take place as the 7 years of good years continue, and then the famine comes, and the famine impacts not just Egypt, but the surrounding part of the Middle East as well, including Canaan, where the brothers are. And so in the midst of the famine, this is chapters 42 and 43, they come to Egypt. And as they arrive there in Egypt, Joseph recognizes them. The famine has arrived, and he sees them. They don't see him. They don't recognize him. They see him, but they don't recognize him. First of all, he's dressed and he's groomed. When I say groomed, the Egyptians didn't go in for these big hairy beards like the Semitic peoples did, like the Israelites did. And so they see Joseph. He's dressed like an Egyptian. He's groomed like an Egyptian, and I get it. I remember one time seeing one of my firefighters who used to actually work for me, and then a few years had passed, and I was at some sort of function, and this fellow came up to me, and I didn't recognize him. I talked to him a bit, and somebody came up after that and said, "Hey, are you mad at so and so?" His name was Jerry. Are you mad at Jerry? And I said, "No, is he around? I'd love to see him." He said, "You were just talking to him." And I'd had it wasn't a long conversation, but a brief conversation, sort of, "How are you doing?" And I hadn't been able to place him, but frankly, I didn't want to say, "I don't know you." Um, and I went back and talked to him, and what had happened, he'd shaved his head, and it was a good look. It didn't look like my old friend, and I hadn't recognized him at all. So I get what happens here. They see Joseph, they don't recognize him. Also, remember, he's older now. He's been in Egypt for quite some time. And he accuses them of being spies, and he has them all arrested. And they say, "No, no, we're not spies. Our father lives back in Canaan. We have a younger brother. We lost a brother, but we have a youngest brother. He didn't come with us on this trip." And he says, "I'll tell you what. I'm going to hold one of you hostage." And so Simeon, he's not the oldest, but he's next down in the line, Simeon and Levi. And I'm going to keep Simeon behind as a hostage for your good behavior. You go back and bring back your younger brother, your youngest brother, and I'll be able to tell that you're telling the truth. And so that's the story that he gives them. And so meanwhile, they go back home. They report this to Jacob, and Jacob says, "I'm not letting Benjamin go." "You mean you're going to leave Simeon in prison?" "I'm not letting Benjamin go." And the famine gets worse, and finally Judah goes. And notice how Judah is the voice of reason. Judah is the one who's acting the part of the leader. And he goes and he says, "You have to do something, or else we're all going to starve to death, Benjamin included." The famine's getting worse, and so they are allowed to all go, Benjamin included. And they get back, and Joseph, his treatment of them is turned completely around. Instead of accusing them as to be spies, Simeon is released, and they're all invited to dinner, and everybody's seated at dinner. Now Joseph isn't seated with them, because Egyptians don't eat with Semitic peoples, with outsiders of any sort. You know, they were very, very class conscious, and let me just say, very race conscious. It wasn't black versus white; it was Egyptian versus non-Egyptian. And so he's seated at one table, and they're seated at a different table, but they're seated in the order of their ages, and they hadn't reported their ages. And they're looking at this, and Benjamin is treated especially well. And then they're given the supplies that they need, and they're sent packing. And Joseph has planted his own cup, and apparently this was a very ornate, valuable thing, has planted that in Benjamin's bag. And so they are sent after him to say, wait a second, what did you steal? Now, again, this reminds me of Laban having come after Joseph, having come after Jacob. Remember that story? Because Laban's gods had been stolen by Rachel. And so here is the youngest son of Rachel being accused. Now it's a plant, but still being accused of having stolen this cup. And they are chased down, and they've been sent away with Joseph's cup planted. And the officials get there, and they say, somebody's stolen the cup, and we're going to search your baggage. And the brothers say, hey, anybody that's caught with it. Remember how Jacob had inadvertently put a curse on Rachel? Had said, if anyone's caught with us, may they be killed. And well, they don't say it quite that way, but they say, if anybody's caught with a cup, may he be taken. And the servants say, well, no, we're not going to kill him, but we're going to, whoever it is going to become a slave to Joseph. And sure enough, because they had planted it there, the cup is found in the bag of Benjamin. And now all the other brothers have to do at this point is say, well, we were innocent, and they can go on their way. And they don't have a lie. They have a true story to tell to their father on why Benjamin was taken away. And at that point, they will have gotten rid of all the favorites. It will be just them and Dad, and Joseph is gone as far as they know, and Benjamin will be gone. And all they have to do is go with the flow. And instead, what happens is they all determined to go back, and they all face Joseph. And as Joseph is saying, hey, it will just be Benjamin that will remain behind. He makes them that offer. It's Judah who gets up and says, take me instead. And I think there's something very striking about the fact that it's Judah that does this. Remember, he's the leader. He's not the oldest. He's not, but he's the leader of the pack. And it will be Judah's great grandson, his ultimate descendant through Mary, Jesus, who will also one day get up and outstretch his hands and say, take me instead. It's a wonderful picture of Christ. And that's the pivotal point in the entire Joseph story, where they're ready to actually, Judah at least, is ready to give his own life as a slave instead of Benjamin. And it shows that there's been a change. This is the same Judah that said, let's sell him into slavery and get rid of him. But no, take me instead. And now Joseph reveals himself. I really am Joseph. And he reveals himself, and everything is okay. And so a message is sent back. The brothers are allowed to go back and get their father Jacob, and the whole family is now going to move to Egypt, and that's chapter 46 of where they're going to come back to Egypt. And they get back to Egypt, and Joseph goes before Pharaoh and says, "Look, I'd like to settle them in this part of the land, part of the land known as Goshen. It's on the eastern side of the Nile Delta. Not a lot had gone on up to this point in that part of the land. Most of Egypt was like right along the Nile, and And the part along the delta, that was sort of the swampland. That wasn't really considered prime property by the Egyptians, at least not yet. Now that's going to change later. But Joseph goes before Pharaoh and intercedes, and Pharaoh says, "Okay, they can stay there." And now we read, and there's actually half the chapter is devoted to this, where Joseph's plan to save Egypt does save Egypt, but in the process, they're not just giving away grain; they're selling it. And they're selling it to the Egyptians who, after a while, they've run out of money. And so they say, well, we don't have money, but we can give our land. And Joseph takes as payment for the grain the land of the Egyptians. So people are giving up their land. They can still live in Egypt, but they no longer are landed property owners. And when they have run out of land and the famine continues, they actually sell themselves into slavery. So this section is actually the Egyptians becoming slaves to the Pharaoh. Very interesting. The Joseph enslavement of the Egyptians takes place. So notice how we'd had Joseph's enslavement in Egypt back in chapters 39 through 40. Here in chapter 37, we have the Egyptians themselves are becoming slaves. And now there's another interlude. The Israelites are in Egypt, Joseph's in Egypt, and this interlude is dealing with Judah. Actually, it's dealing with all the brothers who are called by Jacob and given prophetic blessings. Prophetic, some of them aren't maybe blessings, some of them are just statements. But Judah in particular, it is said of him that the scepter shall not depart from Judah. He not only has he been the leader, but the descendants of Judah are going to be kings over the other Israelite tribes. And that comes out in this interlude of Judah. And also there's some, there is a section where the sons that we're going to look at in a second, where the sons of Joseph are also blessed. But you have Judah blessed as a ruler. And then after Jacob has died, Joseph's brothers are thinking, okay, did that just release the brakes? Is he now going to take us out? And they send word to him, and he says, no, it's okay. You meant, and we're going to look at this passage in just a moment, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. And so notice I have Joseph's brothers hating him, and at the end, Joseph's brothers fear him, but that fear will be put aside in the end. Now, a couple other things that we see in this section toward the end, where Joseph has been manipulating his brothers, not in a bad way, but to bring the family back together. Not just physically, although that's going to be included, but spiritually. Will they again walk away from the youngest hated brother, or maybe he's not hated anymore, Benjamin, or will they take a different way? And that's what's being put to the test. As Moses writes this narrative, assuming Moses is the author of Genesis, God is doing the same thing to the Israelites in the wilderness. He's bringing them back together, not just physically, but spiritually. He's bringing them back to himself as they have been ready to go back to Egypt and abandon God. He's now working in their lives through this story and through their story to do the same thing to Israel. And of course, that brings up the question, what is God doing in your life today to bring you closer to himself? And that's something for you to ponder and on which to reflect. But we want to continue. There's a pattern in Israel's purpose that has been seen all throughout the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph story. First of all, we saw in Abraham's case, he came into the land, he built an altar, he called upon the name of the Lord. He goes to another location there in Canaan, he built an altar, he calls upon the name of the Lord. He goes down to Egypt, no altars there, no calling on the name of the Lord. But when he comes back again, he does it again. Every time we see Abraham moving, all throughout his life, he built an altar and he calls upon the name of the Lord. Isaac, we see him doing that too, to a certain degree. Jacob, not so much, because Jacob actually leaves the land, but when he comes back, he builds an altar, he calls on the name of the Lord, but we never see his sons doing that. It's like they're forgetting God, and they're forgetting to worship God, selling their brother into slavery. That's not worshiping God. So there's an issue there. Secondly, they're forgetting their sense of purpose. God had called them for a special purpose, to be set apart, to be different. And we've already seen one of them taking his father's wife, and Judah marrying a Canaanite, and it won't be long before they have forgotten their sense of purpose. They've forgotten God. They've sort of gone their own way. And so God is doing something to call them back to himself. He is going to unify the family. They were divided. They're selling each other into slavery. Um, they're talking about murdering each other, and he is unifying the family, and he is going to take them down to Egypt into a place where they will be unified whether they want to be or not. And so this is going to bring about, again, whether they want to or not, both racial and religious purity, where they're going to be in Egypt, where the Egyptians aren't going to intermarry with them, not on a regular basis at all. Now Joseph seems to take an Egyptian wife. But he's the rare exception. For the most part, we're going to see the Egyptians will have the Israelites live in a certain part of the land that we don't live there. That's like on the wrong side of the tracks or on the wrong side of the river. Down there in the Delta region, east side of the Delta, and we don't associate with them. We don't communicate with them. They're in their own little part of Egypt, and they'll be left to themselves, so that God has placed them into a place where whether they want to be both racially and religiously pure, they're going to have no option. He's going to put them there so that the nation will grow in this, if I can call it, a national crockpot, a national place where they're going to be left alone by the Egyptians. Next, I mentioned that there is a blessing that Jacob puts on all his sons, but in chapter 48, he also does a blessing on the two sons of Joseph. They're going to get a double portion, so that when we talk about the 12 tribes, there's actually going to be 13 if you count the two sons of Joseph, each as being a tribe. Now there will be 12 lots. There will be 12 parts of the inheritance given when they get into the land. Ephraim and Manasseh will each get an inheritance, but the tribe of Levi will not get a land inheritance. Their portion will be the Lord. So 13 tribes, but 12 portions of the inheritance. And when Jacob goes to bless them, Joseph carefully arranges it or Manasseh, he's the oldest one, and he's going to be under Jacob's right hand, and Ephraim, he's the younger, he's going to be under Jacob's left hand, and Jacob crosses his arms to put his right hand on the head of Ephraim, and Joseph says, "Dad, you're doing it wrong." And Jacob says, No, this is right. Ephraim is going to receive a special blessing. Ephraim is going to be one of the leading leaders of the tribes. I said, I thought that was Judah. Well, Judah and Ephraim both. For example, Joshua is going to come from the tribe of Ephraim. And we're going to see the tribe of Ephraim later on being the leader of the northern tribes. And so they're going to have a special place. So there is a younger brother motif that we're seeing both here, but actually we've seen it all through Genesis. We saw Seth instead of Cain. We saw Isaac instead of Ishmael. We saw Jacob instead of Esau. We saw Perez instead of Zerah. Remember the two sons of Judah. We saw Ephraim now instead of Manasseh. And I think the point is that we have an older brother, and we are the younger brother. We have an older brother who has given us his inheritance in the person of Jesus. Finally, we come to this passage in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 and 20. This is where Jacob has died, and the brothers are worried that Joseph is going to now take his final vengeance upon them. And Joseph instead says to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." The story of Joseph being sold into slavery by his own brothers, that was part of God's plan. Now, God didn't make them do it. They did it because they didn't like Joseph. They did it for their own purposes, but that was part of God's plan, and he meant that plan for good. Notice, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. And that's our story, too. As we look at the cross, Jesus being betrayed and suffering and dying upon the cross, That's a terrible thing. But God meant it for good. Those that were involved in it were doing it for their own reasons, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So that's our story. And we have benefited from that which that was a bad thing, but we have benefited so that we are saved through his death, through his burial, and of course through his resurrection.